Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Welcome to another installment in the Kicking It Old School series, where we take a look at some mechanics from modern D&D and see how it was done in previous editions. Today we're going to be talking about the death and dying rules for player characters in Dungeons & Dragons, and we're going to be actually looking at each of the editions here. Typically with these videos, I've focused on a specific edition for the purposes of discussing a specific mechanic, but today I want to show the evolution, and honestly, for the first bit, it was pretty simple, cut and dry, basic rules. For this video, we're going to be talking about the default method for determining character death. We're not going to be discussing house rules or optional rules here. If you have any house rules or optional rules that aren't similar to what we discuss in this video, then feel free to comment those below, especially for some of the older versions of D&D. It's always interesting to see how people handle the concept of character death there. So we're actually going to start with the 5th edition version of the character death and dying rules, because that is the current version, and it's just good to have sort of a basis of comparison when we take a look at some of these older versions. And you can see how harsh death and dying rules were back in the day and how they have slowly evolved to get us to the point where we are now. So now with 5th edition, if a character is reduced to 0 hit points or takes damage that would take them beyond 0 hit points, they are considered to be in a dying state. If you take amount of damage equal to your maximum hit points after being reduced to 0, then your character dies outright. But that's something that, especially as you progress through levels, becomes harder and harder to achieve. But let's just say, for an example, if you have a character with 50 hit points, they're only at like 1 or 2 hit points, and they take more than they take 56 or 60 points of damage, then they would still be considered dead outright. However, once you get past that initial attack that brought you to 0 hit points or fewer, you never have to worry about any extra damage per se. So once you were reduced to 0 hit points, you are unconscious and you have to begin making death saving throws. A death saving throw is done by rolling a d20, and you need 3 successes to stabilize or 3 failures for your character to die. A failure is a result of 9 or lower on the d20, with a natural 1 being counted as 2 failures instead of 1. A success is if you roll a 10 or higher, meaning that there is a greater than 50% chance that you are going to get a successful result, but you still do have to worry about rolling low, especially if you're me. So if you get a result of 10 or higher, it is a success. 3 successes brings you to being stabilized, but still unconscious. Now, if you roll a natural 20, on the other hand, you not only automatically stabilize, but you immediately regain 1 hit point and are conscious and can begin taking actions again. Once you regain consciousness, any previously succeeded or failed death saving throws are erased. Now, while you are in the dying state, like I said, you don't have to worry about negative hit points or anything like that. However, if you take damage from a source while you're making death saving throws, you immediately suffer a failed death saving throw. So taking damage after the fact is still something to be concerned about, but you don't have to worry about the actual damage. It's just one step closer to character death. So that's the way that it's handled in D&D 5th edition. Well, we're going to take a look at how it's evolved from the earliest days to where we are now. And there's no better place to start with than old school D&D. So these rules are going to be pretty much the exact same for 1st edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, as well as the basic expert rules. So basic expert covers like the Moldvay Cook, it covers the Holmes basic, it's the same rules for D&D 0 edition, as well as the BECMI D&D or the Rules Cyclopedia version of the Dungeons & Dragons game. And it's pretty simple. In those versions of the game, if your character, again, looking at the default rules, if your character reaches 0 hit points, you're dead. That's it. That's all there is to it. Anytime you reach 0, the first time you reach 0, your character is no more. They are deceased. They are an X living character. Pretty basic, pretty simple. Now, second edition did have a lot of optional rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and there is one optional rule that we're not going to really discuss here in this video. I might talk about it in a separate video because it is interesting, but the basis of that optional rule did become the default method for death and dying when we got to the next edition of Dungeons & Dragons. So let's take a look at that one now. So here we have Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition. Well, this is 3.5, but 3rd edition and 3.5 have the exact same rules for character death and dying. So in this version of the game, you actually do have negative hit points. So being reduced to 0 doesn't actually mean character death. In fact, in 3rd edition, being reduced to 0 hit points doesn't even drop you unconscious right away. If you are reduced to exactly 0 hit points, you are considered to be conscious, but in a disabled state. You can still take either a move action or a standard action, but you can't take both on your next turn, and you are not able to take a full round action. If you use your action to only move, then you suffer no additional consequences and you'll remain at 0 hit points. However, if you do something strenuous, like take a standard action to, I don't know, attack or cast a spell, if you are still at 0 hit points by the time you resolve that action, you lose 1 point of damage and drop into negative hit points. So in 3rd edition, you are able to go into negative hit points, but your character dies at -10. And if an attack reduces you to -10 hit points, or at least -10 hit points, then your character is just automatically dead. However, if you're reduced to anywhere between -1 and -9, you are still alive, but you are bleeding out and dying. On each of your turns that you are in negative hit points, you do get to roll to see if you stabilize on your own. Now, this is done with either a percentile dice or you can use a d20. You do have a 10% chance to stabilize on your own, and that number does not get modified. So it's either 10% on the percentile dice, or you can choose the d20 and say either a 1 or a 2, or a 19 or 20, or a 1 or a 20, however you want to do it, but you choose basically the two numbers before you roll, before you make any rolls. And if you get those two numbers, then your character is stabilized. However, they will remain at the negative hit point value that they're at. If they fail to stabilize, then they lose an additional hit point and get 1 step closer to that -10. Characters can be stabilized through the heal skill, or if they receive any type of healing, it will stabilize them. However, they will remain unconscious if they are still in negative hit points. So if you're at -8, for example, and you get healed for 6 hit points, you would still be at -2. However, you are no longer at risk of dying unless something happens and you take another point of damage some point thereafter. So that's the way that 3rd edition handled it. And what's interesting about the 3rd edition one is we do have that stabilization check. Now, it is only a 10% chance, so it is pretty slim. However, you do get the possibility of making 9 rolls to see if you stabilize. So there is a decent chance that it is something that you can do on your own. Not a great chance, but it's still a chance nonetheless. Now, what I think is interesting about that stabilization check is it is kind of the earliest version of what we think of with the death saving throws today. If you fail, then you slip 1 step closer to death, and if you succeed, then your character is stabilized. Now, it's kind of the earliest version. It's like the seed from which death saving throws would grow, which is kind of a weird metaphor if I think about it, because we're talking about death here. But it is interesting to sort of see that this was the first version of the game to really have something in place where you can try to stabilize on your own. Now, I said this is sort of the seed from which death saving throws would sprout. However, the 5th edition version is not the fruit of that seed, I guess you can say, because we're going to take a look now at the next version of D&D, the first version to really incorporate death saving throws. And we're going to see how similar it is to 5th edition, while at the same time how different it is from 5th edition. So let's take a look at that one right now. So here we have Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. Now, the rules that I'm going to discuss here are the same for 4th edition as it is for the D&D Essentials line, which was essentially a retooling of the 4e rule set. and aimed more or less at a newer audience, but the mechanics are pretty much the exact same. So in 4th edition, you do have the introduction of the death saving throw. So if your character is reduced to 0 hit points, or if you would take damage in excess of what would drop you to 0 hit points, you fall unconscious. So unlike 3rd edition being at exactly 0, you are not able to remain conscious and take actions afterwards. You are knocked unconscious at 0 hit points in 4E, similar to 5th edition, the way that 5th edition handles being reduced to 0 hit points or taking damage beyond that. Now, 4th edition does still have negative hit points, but they're not quite the same as what we had with 3rd edition. So if a character takes damage that takes them to their bloodied value in negative hit points, then they are considered to be dead. Your bloodied value is equal to half of your maximum hit point value rounded down. So if you had 50 hit points, for example, your bloodied value would have you at 25. So your character would die at negative 25 hit points. Now, once you reach negative hit points, as long as it doesn't immediately reach that bloodied threshold, you don't start taking additional points of damage on a failure to stabilize like you do in 3rd edition. However, you still need to be concerned about your negative hit point value if you get hit with subsequent attacks, either directed at you or being caught in areas of effect. And if that damage total does reach your bloodied value in negative hit points, then your character still dies. However, if you don't reach that value, like I said, you're making your death saving throws, which a saving throw in 4th edition is a d20 roll. Typically, there are no modifiers to those saving throws in 4th edition unless you have a feat or class feature or ability that grants you a bonus on specific saving throws. For example, in 5th edition, not 5th edition, D&D Essentials, there is a feat that gives you a +5 bonus to death saving throws and death saving throws only. So how do the death saving throw system work in 4th edition? In 4E, you roll your d20. If you get a result of 9 or lower on the d20, you have gained a failed death saving throw, with 3 failed death saving throws, meaning that your character is dead. Sound familiar? However, a natural 1 is no different from any other number of 9 or lower. So a natural 1 doesn't count as 2 failed. There's no additional effect. It's just a failed saving throw. Now, unlike 5th edition, however, you don't get 3 successes to automatically stabilize. So if you get a result of 10 or higher on the d20, your condition remains unchanged. Now, the only way to change your condition is if you get a result of 20 or higher. A natural 20 in of itself has no inherent benefit for a death saving throw, the same way that a natural 1 has no inherent detriment to you, because there may be things that give you penalties to those saving throws as well. So something may give you a -2 to your death saving throws, meaning that a natural 20 would be modified to an 18. So the number on the die isn't as important as what your total is if you have any bonuses to add. So if you had that +5 bonus for death saving throws that you get in D&D Essentials, if you take the right feat, then you can be considered to stabilize if you get a roll of 15 or higher. But there's no amount of results higher than 10 that will stabilize you. You have to reach that 20 threshold, either naturally on the die or modified by bonuses. If you get a 20 or greater for your death saving throw, then you do gain the ability to stabilize by spending one of your character's healing surges, and it has to be a healing surge. A healing surge is something that you gain a number of equal or determined by your class. It's somewhat similar to what we think of when it comes to hit dice in 5th edition, but instead of you rolling randomly, it is a fixed total, and the amount that you heal for a healing surge is equal to half of your bloodied value, once again rounded down. So if you're using the 50 hit point example that we had before, your bloodied value is at 25, and your healing surge value would be at 12. Half of 25 is 12.5, but you round down to the nearest number, so you would gain 12 hit points. Now, if you have negative hit points in 4th edition, you only worry about them when it comes to making that negative hit point total in your equal to your bloodied value. Otherwise, healing is treated as if you were at 0 hit points. So you don't have to worry about, like in 3rd edition, for example, you have to heal through those negative hit points to get to a positive value before you regain consciousness. In 4th edition, you start at 0. So if you had negative 15 hit points, but you use a healing surge that brings you up to 12, you would be at 12 hit points. You don't have to worry about those negative 15 when it comes to healing. Now, if you don't have a healing surge available to you, if you've used them all, then your condition remains unchanged and you are forced to continue making rolls until someone either uses a skill to heal, to stabilize you, or you receive some form of healing that doesn't rely on you spending one of your own healing surges. So in this version of the game, if you're out of healing surges, then you're basically rolling every round, hoping to get anything above a 9 for your total result, meaning that the longer things go, if you don't have a healing surge to spend, the more likely it is that your character is going to eventually get those 3 failed rolls. So it is something to be wary of. Now, another thing that you have to be wary of, again, with 4th edition, is that once you regain consciousness, those failed death saving throws don't automatically go away like they do in 5th edition. They remain on your character sheet until you complete, at minimum, a short rest after combat. A short rest, I believe, is 5 to 10 minutes in D&D 4th edition. But during combat itself, those failed death saving throws are still there, meaning that if you get back up and you had, let's just for example, had 2 failed death saving throws, you stabilize, you spend a healing surge, you get back up, you jump back into the fight, you get hit with another attack that drops you back into the dying range, your character will die the next time they get a death saving throw result of 9 or less on the dice, plus, applicable bonuses. So it's something that you have to be concerned about. It's not like 5th edition where you can just keep getting, knocked down, get back up, get knocked down again, get back up, and repeat the process as many times as you can. In 4th edition, it is a very, very scary prospect of having those 2 failed saving throws if you do, or even having 1 failed saving throw, and knowing that that's still there if you get knocked down again. So that's the way that 4th edition handled the death and dying rules. So those were the older versions of the death and dying rules in D&D, as well as an explanation of the way that it works in 5e for comparison. So you can see that it goes from 0 when you're dead to you have a slim chance of surviving even if you get dropped to below 0 hit points, to making those death saving throws, however, having to live in fear of those failed death saving throws still being there if you get knocked back down, to what we have in 5th edition, where you have a greater than 50% chance to succeed on each and every single roll that you make. And once you succeed 3 times, all of the others, the failed results, all disappear. So let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite versions of the death and dying rules throughout the various editions of Dungeons & Dragons? Are you the type of player that, expects your character to be dead at 0 hit points? Do you like the -10 and bleeding out rule set from 3rd edition? Do you like the concept of death saving throws but prefer the way that it was handled in 4e? Or are you full on board with the way that they're handled in 5th edition? Also, if you have any unique or interesting house rules that you may have used that are different from the methods we discussed here today, you can certainly let me know that in the comments below. As far as optional rules go, like I said, there is the 2nd edition At Death's Door rule. I may actually do that as a separate video because it's similar to what we have with the 3rd edition version, but there are some key differences, but it's not a default rule. It was an optional rule, and today we're only talking about default rules. So save any discussion on the 2nd edition AD&D optional rule for when I do that video later on. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next time. Until then, take care.